Hey guys, welcome back to Based MMA. The UFC 300 main event is probably going to be announced anytime now, probably maybe tonight, sometime this week, maybe early next week. And we still don't have a clear idea of what might be the main event for UFC 300. So in this video, I'm going to, be making my final prediction on what is possible for UFC 300's main event. Obviously, we have an idea of what fighters might be in consideration for UFC 300's main event. And let's start off with Tom Aspinall. I mean, Tom Aspinall came out yesterday and in some tweets talked about the fact that the UFC had called him to see if he wanted to fight Stipe Miocic for UFC 300. And I think that's an incredible idea. And it turns out that Stipe Miocic turned down the fight against Tom Aspinall and that he's only looking to come back and fight Jon Jones, which I also understand from his point of view. Even though I'm not a fan of the UFC making Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic, I'm sure you've heard me rant about that fight plenty of times now, so I'm not going to rant about it in this video. But, it means that the UFC doesn't really have a concrete plan for UFC 300's main event. As I've told you in my last couple of videos, I said, look, I'm not saying that UFC 300 is a terrible card whatsoever, but what I am saying is that I don't think they've had a plan for the main event of UFC 300 unless it turns out to be Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, which at that point I'd be like, all right, credit to you, credit to the UFC, because I did not see that coming. They baited us all. They made it seem like Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler was going to happen for June 29. It turns out that it's actually going to happen at UFC 300. It's going to make fans go crazy. And I think that would save UFC 300. Not that it needs saving because it's already a great card, but it would definitely level up the card and really make it a satisfying UFC 300 for the fans. So Tom Aspinall is out, in my opinion. I don't think Tom Aspinall is going to be the main event of UFC 300. I definitely think that the UFC was considering making Tom Aspinall versus Stipe Miocic for the main of UFC 300. I think it's a big enough fight to make it for UFC 300, but I also understand from Stipe Miocic's point of view and Jon Jones that if Tom Aspinall beats Stipe Miocic, which is the most probable outcome, then you have to make Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall, which is the fight that the fans want. So it also means that the UFC was considering is considering at some point making that Tom Aspinall versus Jon Jones fight. But Stipe Miocic has turned down the fight. It is what it is. So scratch out Tom Aspinall from being the main event of UFC 300. Now let's move on to another fighter who I think has a higher likelihood of being the main event of UFC 300, and that's Alex Pereira. I mean, Alex Pereira has teased that he might be fighting at UFC 300. I thought they were going to announce his opponent soon, so maybe they don't have an opponent for him. Originally I thought they're going to make Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 3 for UFC 300. It's a big enough fight. It's the trilogy. But I also think that the UFC has realized, like, for example, you make that fight, right? Let's say you make Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya. It's a big fight. Obviously, it's going to sell. But let's assume, it's a possibility that Israel Adesanya could beat Alex Pereira. And if Adesanya beats Alex Pereira, you guys really think he's going to stay in the light heavyweight division? And if he vacates the belt at light heavyweight, then you kind of leave the light heavyweight division in a bit of a mess. And it's been a mess for the last couple of years. And I don't know if the UFC wants to do that. I think right now what the UFC wants to do with the light heavyweight division is have Alex Pereira fight, defend his title, fight contenders, and just bring back just make the light heavyweight division more normal. Because if you bring Israel Adesanya into the picture and he beats Alex Pereira, which is very possible. I mean, he beat him a year ago. It kind of messes up the light heavyweight division, and I don't really see Israel Adesanya making a permanent move to the light heavyweight division. If he were to, then maybe that kind of changes things, and maybe it kind of pushes the UFC to make Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya. It also doesn't help that Israel Adesanya is coming off a loss to Sean Strickland, so I feel like it's kind of hard to sell in that aspect. I mean, you could sell it in the fact that Israel Adesanya just beat Alex Pereira a year ago, so I guess it kind of sells. It's a big enough fight. Two big superstars right now currently in the UFC, so I understand why the UFC might try to make that fight for UFC 300. I don't think they're going to go in that direction anymore. I was starting to think that maybe they were going to go in that direction. I don't think so anymore. So who can Alex Pereira possibly fight? I mean, he could fight Jamal Hill. Now, I love that fight. I think that fight would be perfect for UFC 300. One, because, Alex Pereira is a big star. I think that Jamal Hill matchup is very interesting. Maybe a lot of casuals are not familiar with Jamal Hill, but he's a pretty fun fighter. I mean, he has great striking, a lot of power, and stylistically, it would be a great match for UFC 300. Now, another option could be Magomed Ankalaev. The problem with Magomed Ankalaev is that I don't see him being a good headliner for UFC 300 as much as he might deserve this title shot. Stylistically, it might not be the best fight that you can make. Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira. I don't think the UFC is going to go in that direction. I think Magomed Ankalaev is a very underrated fighter. I actually think I'm a fan of Magomed Ankalaev, but I don't think a lot of fans are, especially people that don't like the Dagestanis. So I think the tricky part about UFC 300 that I've mentioned is that you have to get recognizable names. You have to get guys that, people know about, but you also have to make matchups that are exciting for UFC 300, which is the tricky part, right? Because you have to make fights that make sense, and then you have to make fights that are stylistically entertaining. So that could be kind of tricky because there's a lot of fights that make sense. For example, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2, but it's not a stylistic fight that you're like, wow, like it's gonna be violent. It's gonna be this great battle. No, none of these fights are like that. So I understand from the UFC's point of view that they're in a tricky position because you have to make fights that the fans are going to be very excited to see, but also with recognizable names. So I think if they're going to bring Alex Pereira into UFC 300, I think most likely he would either fight Israel Adesanya or Jamal Hill. I tend to believe that he most likely would fight Jamal Hill. Now, let me tell you why I'm starting to believe that maybe he's not going to fight at UFC 300. The reason why is because the card right after UFC 300, UFC 301 is going to take place in May in Brazil. So I could see them waiting to make Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill for May, especially if Jamal Hill still needs more time to recover from his injury. I could see them doing that. So, okay. So now let's assume that Alex Pereira is not going to be fighting at UFC 300. So who could be the main event, right? Israel Adesanya. I mean, Israel Adesanya could headline the event against Dricus du Plessis. Now, as much as some of you are going to be happy about that, some of you would be very happy with that main event, I would hate it. And I'm going to tell you why I would hate it. First of all, Israel Adesanya does not deserve a title shot in the middleweight division. I get that the Dricus du Plessis fight would be a huge fight for the UFC, but let's be honest as well. Let's be honest about Dricus du Plessis. I mean, he's coming off a very close competitive fight against Sean Strickland where he did take a lot of damage. I mean, look at the guy. He visually looked beaten up. And then you're trying to set him up by putting him by making him make a quick turnaround against Israel Adesanya at UFC 300. To me, that would feel kind of slimy by the UFC. It would feel dirty. It would show that they're clearly biased and they're trying to set up Adesanya to beat Dricus du Plessis. They're probably trying to give Adesanya the most advantages going into the fight. So I wouldn't want to see it. Not that I wouldn't want to see the fight ever. I just wouldn't want to see it for UFC 300 just because I think it would be too quick of a turnaround for Dricus du Plessis. And it's not a fight where he knocked out Sean Strickland in the first round and took no damage. It was a 5-round hard-fought battle, and his body's probably going to need a lot of recovery. And UFC 300 is about 2-3 months away. That's not enough time, in my opinion. You could make Israel Adesanya versus Hamza Chimaev. Now, the problem with that fight is that it can't be the main event. You know what I'm saying? So I would love for the UFC to make Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill for the main event of UFC 300. Co-main event, Israel Adesanya versus Hamza Chimaev. Make it for an interim belt. I don't even care. Make it for an interim belt. And then maybe have Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2. But, even though that fight had been rumored to be for UFC 300, we all kind of knew that it was most likely not going to be the main event. And so we all kind of assumed that, okay, that might be the co-main event of the card. But we really haven't gotten any announcements. I mean, I would have thought that if that fight was going to be at UFC 300, we probably would have gotten an announcement by now that Leon Edwards was going to be fighting Bilal Muhammad at UFC 300. So I don't really see that being the main event. Now I'm even questioning if it's even going to be the co-main event, if it's even going to be on the card. So now the other possibility, maybe a surprise. Like I said, Conor McGregor might be on the card. Maybe a fight that we don't really see coming. But most likely, I think the main event for UFC 300 is gonna involve Alex Pereira or Israel Adesanya in some way. Either they're gonna try to make that Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis fight. They're gonna try to make Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill, which I would be in favor of, or they might, they might make Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 3 for UFC 300, which was a fight that I was starting to think that was very possible now. But my point remains the same, where they don't have a plan for UFC 300's main event. Most likely, if they come out with a surprise that Conor McGregor is going to be on the card, or they've had a UFC 300 main event, then I'll come out here and say that I was wrong. You know what I'm saying? But if Tom Aspinall is coming out with tweets saying, they called me if I wanted to be the main event of UFC 300 against Stipe Miocic, it tells me that the UFC right now is scrambling to make a good main event for UFC 300. And like I said, I'm not saying that the card is absolutely terrible whatsoever, but what I'm saying is that they probably never had a concrete plan for UFC 300. I still think it's going to be a great card. I just hope we get a good main event. And as much as the Adesanya versus Dricus fight would be a huge fight, I just think it would be too quick of a turnaround for Dricus. And, it would kind of seem kind of slimy to me. It would kind of seem like the UFC is trying to set up Dricus du Plessis to lose against Adesanya, because they're making him do a quick turnaround, just like they were trying to make him do a quick turnaround against after he won against Robert Whittaker when he had a broken foot for UFC 293. So it kind of feels like they're trying to do the same things. I don't like that whatsoever. I think Dricus du Plessis needs to come back in June, July, see him in the summer. And, there's even talks of potentially, giving Sean Strickland the rematch, not by the UFC, but by a lot of fans, because the fight was very close. A lot of people had Sean Strickland winning. So right now, guys, UFC 300's main event is going to be announced anytime now, in my opinion. And like I said, I think Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill is most likely going to be the main event of UFC 300. I could see them making Israel Adesanya versus Dricus du Plessis. But like I said, I wouldn't want to see that fight. If anything, I would want to see Israel Adesanya versus Hamza Chimaev at UFC 300. Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill. You add those two fights to the card. The card is chef's kiss. Would be amazing, guys. Make sure to like and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one.